Thomas Jefferson, April 13, 1743 to July 4, 1826, was an American statesman, diplomat, lawyer, architect, philosopher, and founding father who served as the United States' third president from 1801 to 1809. He was the main author of the Declaration of Independence. Following the American Revolutionary War, and before becoming president in 1801, Jefferson served as George Washington's first Secretary of State and John Adams' second vice president. During the American Revolution, Jefferson represented Virginia in the Second Continental Congress and was Virginia's second governor from 1779 to 1781. Congress appointed Jefferson as the United States Minister to France in 1785, where he remained until 1789. President Washington then appointed Jefferson as the nation's first Secretary of State, a position he held from 1790 to 1793. During the early 1790s, Jefferson and James Madison founded the Democratic-Republican Party to challenge the Federalist Party during the development of the nation's first party system. Jefferson and Federalist John Adams became both friends and political opponents. In the 1796 U.S. presidential election between the two, Jefferson finished second, making him Adams' vice president under the electoral laws of the period. 4 years later, in the 1800 presidential election, Jefferson challenged Adams and triumphed. In 1804, Jefferson was overwhelmingly re-elected to a second term. As president, Jefferson boldly defended the country's shipping and economic interests against Barbary pirates and hostile British trade tactics. Beginning in 1803, he pursued a Western expansionist agenda with the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the country's geographic size. To make place for colonization, Jefferson began the process of removing Indian tribes from the newly acquired region. As a result of peace talks with France, Jefferson was able to cut military forces and spending. During his second presidential tenure, Jefferson had domestic issues, including the trial of his former vice president, Aaron Burr. Jefferson enacted the Embargo Act in 1807 to protect the nation's industries from British threats to U.S. ships, limiting foreign trade and fostering the growth of the American industrial sector. Jefferson's public achievements are generally praised by presidential scholars and historians, notably his advocacy for religious freedom and tolerance, his peaceful acquisition of the Louisiana Territory from France, and his leadership in backing the Lewis and Clark expedition. Jefferson is consistently regarded among the top 10 U.S. presidents, yet his involvement with slavery is still contested. Jefferson owned slaves, although he criticized the slave trade in his draft of the Declaration of Independence and signed the act prohibiting slavery importation in 1807. Since the 1790s, he has been alleged to have had children with his slave Sally Hemings. Scholarly opinion suggests that Jefferson fathered at least 6 children with her. Jefferson's writings and advocacy for human rights, such as freedom of thought, speech, and religion, were significant inspirations for the American Revolution and subsequent Revolutionary War, during which the 13 colonies successfully separated from British America and established the United States as a free and sovereign nation. Jefferson was an outspoken supporter of democracy, republicanism, and individual liberties, producing seminal documents and decisions at the state, national, and international levels. Libertarians have utilized Jefferson's works to advocate for natural rights and limited government. Early life and career. Jefferson, the third of 10 children, was born on the family's Shadwell plantation in the British colony of Virginia on April 13, 1743, April 2, 1743, Old Style, Julian calendar. He was of English and maybe Welsh heritage and was born as a British person. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a planter and surveyor who died when Jefferson was 14. His mother's name was Jane Randolph. Peter Jefferson relocated his family to Tuckahoe Plantation in 1745, following the death of William Randolph III, the plantation's owner and Jefferson's friend, who had chosen Peter as guardian of Randolph's children. The Jeffersons returned to Shadwell before October 1753. Peter died in 1757, and his fortune was divided between his 2 sons, Thomas and Randolph. John Harvey Sr. became Thomas's guardian when he was 13 years old. Thomas acquired around 5,000 acres, 2,000 hectares, 7.8 square miles, including Monticello, and assumed full legal power over the property at the age of 21. Education and early family life. Jefferson began his education with the Randolph children at Tuckahoe, where he received tutoring. Thomas's father, Peter, who was self-taught and regretted not receiving a formal education, enrolled his son in an English school when he was 5 years old. At the age of 9, in 1752, he enrolled in a local school run by a Scottish Presbyterian priest and began studying the natural world, which he came to enjoy. At this time, he began studying Latin, Greek, and French, as well as learning to ride horses. Thomas also read novels from his father's small collection. The Reverend James Morey taught him from 1758 to 1760 near Gordonsville, Virginia, where he studied history, physics, and the classics while staying with Morey's family. Jefferson met a variety of American Indians, including Cherokee Chief Ostinaco, who frequently visited Shadwell on his route to Williamsburg to trade. In Williamsburg, Jefferson met and admired Patrick Henry, who was 8 years his senior, and they both enjoyed playing the violin. Jefferson enrolled in the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, in 1761, at the age of 16, and studied mathematics, metaphysics, and philosophy under William Small. Jefferson became acquainted with the theories of British empiricists such as John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton while studying under Small. Small introduced Jefferson to both George Wythe and Francis Fauquier. Small, Wythe, and Fauquier recognized Jefferson's extraordinary abilities and invited him into their inner circle, where he became a fixture at their Friday dinner gatherings. Jefferson subsequently remarked that he heard more common good sense, more rational and philosophical conversations than in all the rest of my life while there. During his first year of college, Jefferson spent significant time attending parties that he enjoyed dancing and was not particularly frugal with his spending. In his second year, realizing that he had wasted time and money in his first year, he committed to studying 15 hours each day. While at William and Mary, Jefferson joined the Flat Hat Club. Jefferson graduated in 1762. He studied law under Wythe's supervision while working as a law clerk in his office. Jefferson was well versed in a wide range of disciplines, including history, natural law, natural religion, ethics, and numerous branches of science, such as agriculture. During his years of study under Wythe's supervision, Jefferson wrote a commonplace book, which was a summary of his substantial reading. Wythe was so impressed by Jefferson that he left his whole library to him. On July 20, 1765, Jefferson's sister Martha married his close friend and college buddy Dabney Carr, which pleased him considerably. In October of that year, however, Jefferson lamented his sister Jane's untimely death at the age of 25. He composed a Latin farewell tombstone for her. Jefferson cherished his literature and built 3 huge libraries during his lifetime. He began assembling his first library, which expanded to 200 books, when he was young. It contained literature inherited from his father and entrusted to him by Wythe. In 1770, however, Jefferson's first library was destroyed by fire at his Shadwell residence. His second library supplemented the first. It had grown to 1,250 titles by 1773, and approximately 6,500 volumes by 1814. Jefferson divided his novels into 3 main categories that correspond to aspects of the human mind: memory, reason, and imagination. After British forces burned down the Library of Congress during the 1814 burning of Washington, Jefferson surrendered his second library to the United States government for $23,950, hoping to help kickstart its rebuilding. Jefferson utilized a portion of the money to repay some of his substantial debts. However, Jefferson quickly resumed accumulating what amounted to his third personal library, telling John Adams, "I cannot live without books." By the time he died a decade later, the collection had approximately 2,000 books. Lawyer and House of Burgesses. Jefferson was admitted to the Virginia bar in 1767 and lived with his mother at Shadwell. He served as Albemarle County's representative in the Virginia House of Burgesses from 1769 to 1775. He advocated for slavery reform, including authoring and backing legislation in 1769 that stripped power from the royal governor and courts, giving slave masters the discretion to emancipate them. Jefferson urged his cousin Richard Bland to promote the legislation's passage, but it was met with fierce opposition in a state with a predominantly agricultural economy. Jefferson accepted 7 cases of slaves seeking freedom and waived his fee for one he believed should be liberated before the minimum statutory age for emancipation. Natural law was the basis for Jefferson's argument that everyone comes into the world with a right to his own person and using it at his own will. This is what is called personal liberty, and is given him by the author of nature, because it is necessary for his own sustenance. The court interrupted him and ruled against his client. As a consolation, Jefferson handed his client some money, which he may have used to facilitate his escape shortly afterwards. However, Jefferson's underlying intellectual argument that all people were entitled by their creator to what he called a natural right to liberty is one that he would eventually include into the Declaration of Independence. In 1767, he presided over 68 cases for the General Court of Virginia, including 3 noteworthy decisions: Howell v. Netherland, 1770, Balling v. Balling, 1771, and Blair v. Blair, 1772. In response to the British Parliament approving the Intolerable Acts in 1774, Jefferson issued a resolution asking for a day of fasting and prayer as well as a boycott of all British goods. Jefferson's resolution was later developed into a summary view of the rights of British America, in which he claimed that citizens have the right to self-government. Monticello, Marriage and Family. In 1768, Jefferson began construction on his primary mansion, Monticello, which means little mountain in Italian, on a mountaintop overlooking his 5,000-acre, 20 square kilometers, 7.8 square miles, plantation. He spent the majority of his adult life as an architect, and he was cited as stating, "Architecture is my delight, and putting up, and pulling down, one of my favorite amusements." Local masons and carpenters, with the assistance of Jefferson's slaves, completed the majority of the construction. He moved to the South Pavilion in 1770. Monticello's transformation into a neoclassical masterpiece in the Palladian style was his ongoing undertaking. On January 1, 1772, Jefferson married his third cousin, 51, Martha Wales Skelton, the 23-year-old widow of Bathurst Skelton. She was a frequent hostess for Jefferson and oversaw the enormous household. According to biographer Dumas Malone, Jefferson's marriage was the happiest era of his life. Martha read extensively, did excellent needlework, and was an accomplished pianist. Jefferson frequently accompanied her on the violin or cello. Martha gave birth to 6 children during their 10-year marriage: Martha Patsy, 1772 to 1836, Jane, 1774 to 1775, an unknown son who lived for only a few weeks in 1777, Mary Polly, 1778 to 1804, Lucy Elizabeth, 1780 to 1781, and another Lucy Elizabeth, 1782 to 1784. Only Martha and Mary survived into maturity. Martha's father, John Wales, died in 1773. The couple inherited 135 slaves, 11,000 acres, 45 square kilometers, 17 square miles, and the estate's debts. It took Jefferson years to pay off his obligations, which contributed to his financial problems. Martha later suffered from several illnesses, including diabetes, and repeated pregnancies debilitated her. Martha's mother died while she was young, so she grew up with 2 stepmothers. She died on September 6, 1782, just a few months after giving birth to her final child, with Jefferson by her side. Martha made Jefferson pledge never to marry again, saying she couldn't take having another mother raise her children. Jefferson was distraught by her death, pacing back and forth. After 3 weeks, he reappeared, taking long rambling drives on remote roads with his daughter Martha, who described him as a solitary witness to many a violent burst of grief. After serving as the United States Secretary of State from 1790 to 1793 during Washington's presidency, Jefferson returned to Monticello and began rebuilding it using architectural notions he had learned and acquired in Europe. The work proceeded for the majority of his term and was completed in 1809. Revolutionary War. Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was the main author of the Declaration of Independence. He was one of the youngest delegates to the Second Continental Congress, which convened in 1775 at the commencement of the American Revolutionary War and overwhelmingly supported a formal declaration of independence from Britain. Jefferson was motivated by Locke and Montesquieu's teachings, as well as the Enlightenment concepts of individual sanctity. Jefferson sought out John Adams, a Massachusetts Continental Congress delegate and potential Congress leader. They became great friends, and Adams backed Jefferson's selection to the Committee of Five, tasked by Congress with writing a proclamation of independence. The five were Adams, Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Robert R. Livingston, and Roger Sherman. The group first believed Adams should write the document, but Adams persuaded them to prefer Jefferson. Jefferson talked with his fellow committee members, but he largely drafted the Declaration of Independence by himself between June 11 and 28, 1776, in a residence he rented at 700 Market Street in Center City, Philadelphia. Jefferson drew heavily on his proposed Virginia Constitution, George Mason's draft of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and other materials. Other committee members made a few revisions, and a final draft was delivered to Congress on June 28, 1776. The Declaration was introduced on Friday, June 28, and Congress began debating its contents on Monday, July 1, resulting in the removal of nearly one-fourth of Jefferson's initial text. Jefferson despised the changes, but he did not discuss them publicly. The Congress passed the Declaration on July 4, 1776, and delegates signed it on August 2. In doing so, the delegates were deliberately committing high treason against the Crown, the most serious criminal felony punished by torture and death. Jefferson's preamble is recognized as an enduring statement on individual and human rights, and the phrase, "all men are created equal," has been termed one of the best-known sentences in the English language. According to historian Joseph Ellis, the Declaration of Independence is the most potent and consequential words in American history, 2008. Virginia State Legislator and Governor. On September 26, 1775, Colonel Jefferson was appointed leader of the Albemarle County Militia, marking the beginning of the Revolution. In September 1776, he was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates for Albemarle County, just as the state constitution was being finalized. He worked on the Constitution for nearly 3 years and was particularly proud of his bill for establishing religious freedom, which prevented the state from supporting religious institutions or enforcing any doctrine. The bill, along with his measure to disestablish the Anglican Church, failed to pass, although James Madison eventually revived both. In 1778, Jefferson was assigned the responsibility of amending the state statutes. He wrote 126 bills in 3 years, including legislation to reform the judicial system. He advocated rules for general education, which he saw as the foundation of Republican government. Jefferson was also concerned that Virginia's powerful landed gentry would become a hereditary aristocracy, so he spearheaded the effort to abolish what he called feudal and unnatural distinctions. He was particularly interested in regulations like entail and primogeniture, which gave a deceased landowner's oldest son complete ownership and jurisdiction over all land. Jefferson was elected governor for a 1-year term in 1779 and 1780. He relocated the state capital from Williamsburg to Richmond and enacted further legislation regarding public education, religious freedom, and inheritance. During General Benedict Arnold's 1781 invasion of Virginia, Jefferson evacuated Richmond just ahead of the British Army, who destroyed the city. He issued emergency dispatches to Colonel Sampson Matthews and other commanders in an attempt to counter Arnold's advances. That March, General Charles Cornwallis sent a horse force led by Banastre Tarleton to seize Jefferson and members of the Assembly at Monticello, but Jack Jowett of the Virginia militia foiled the British plan. Jefferson fled to Poplar Forest, his farm to the west. When the General Assembly reconvened in June 1781, it undertook an investigation into Jefferson's behavior, ultimately concluding that he had acted honorably, but he was not re-elected. In April of the same year, his 1-year-old daughter Lucy died. A second girl with same name was born the following year, but she died at the age of 3. In 1782, Jefferson refused a partnership offer from North Carolina Governor Abner Nash in a profit-making scheme involving the selling of confiscated Loyalist lands. Unlike several founders, Jefferson was satisfied with his Monticello estate and the acreage he possessed near Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. Jefferson envisioned Monticello as an intellectual gathering place for his pals James Madison and James Monroe. Notes on the state of Virginia. In 1780, Jefferson received a letter from French diplomat François Barbe Marbois inquiring about the geography, history, and administration of Virginia as part of a study of the United States. Jefferson compiled his comments in a book titled Notes on the State of Virginia, 1785. He spent 5 years writing the book, which included assessments of scientific knowledge, Virginia's history, politics, laws, culture, and geography. The book examines what makes a good society, using Virginia as an example. Jefferson included detailed statistics about the state's natural resources and economy, as well as lengthy writings on slavery and miscegenation. He explained his belief that blacks and whites could not coexist as free individuals in one society due to justified resentments of the oppressed. He also expressed his thoughts on the American Indian, comparing them to European colonizers. Notes was initially published in French in 1785 and translated into English in 1787. Biographer George Tucker found the effort surprising in the extent of the information which a single individual had been thus far able to acquire. As to the physical features of the state, Merrill D. Peterson hailed it as an achievement for which all Americans should be grateful. Member of Congress. Jefferson was appointed a Virginia delegate to the Congress of the Confederation, which was formed following the 1783 peace treaty with Great Britain. He served on the committee that determined international exchange rates and proposed an American currency based on the decimal system, which was eventually accepted. He recommended that the Committee of the States be formed to replace the power vacuum created by Congress's retreat. The committee convened when Congress adjourned, but differences rendered it ineffective. In the 1783 to 1784 session of Congress, Jefferson served as chairman of committees tasked with establishing a sustainable system of administration for the new republic and proposing a program for Western Territory settlement. He was the primary author of the Land Ordinance of 1784, by which Virginia relinquished to the national government the enormous territory it claimed northwest of the Ohio River. He argued that this land should not be exploited as colonial territory by any of the 13 states, but rather divided into pieces that could become states. He drew borders for 9 new states in their early phases and drafted an act prohibiting slavery in all of the country's territory. Congress made significant changes and rejected the ban on slavery. The Jefferson Proviso clauses prohibiting slavery were updated and enforced 3 years later in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, becoming law for the entire Northwest Territory. Minister for France. The Congress of the Confederation appointed Jefferson on May 7, 1784, to join Benjamin Franklin and John Adams in Paris as Minister Plenipotentiary for negotiating treaties of amity and commerce with Great Britain and other countries. He left with his little daughter Patsy and 2 maids in July 1784, landing in Paris the following month. Jefferson arranged for Patsy to be schooled at Pentamont Abbey. Less than a year later, he was given the added responsibility of succeeding Franklin as minister to France. The French foreign minister, Count de Vergennes, observed, "You replace Monsieur Franklin, I hear." Jefferson responded, "I succeed. No man can replace him." During his 5 years in Paris, Jefferson had a key influence in formulating American foreign policy. In 1786, he met and married Maria Causeway, a 27-year-old Italian-English pianist. She returned to Great Britain after 6 weeks, but they kept up a lifetime correspondence. Jefferson visited London in the summer of 1786 to meet with John Adams, the United States ambassador to Britain. Adams had formal access to George III and set up a meeting between Jefferson and the king. Jefferson later referred to the king's reception of the men as ungracious. According to Adams' grandson, George III turned his back on both in an act of public disrespect. Jefferson returned to France in August. In June 1787, Jefferson sent for his youngest surviving child, Polly, who was 9 years old. She was accompanied by a young Monticello slave named Sally Hemings. Jefferson had taken her older brother, James Hemings, to Paris as a member of his domestic staff and taught him in French cooking. According to Sally's son, Madison Hemings, at the age of 16, Sally and Jefferson had a sexual connection in Paris, where she became pregnant. According to the son, Hemings agreed to return to the United States only after Jefferson pledged to release her children when they reached the age of majority. While in France, Jefferson became a regular companion of the Marquis de Lafayette, a French hero from the American Revolution, and used his influence to secure trade agreements with France. As the French Revolution began, he permitted Lafayette and other Republicans to hold meetings at his Paris property, the Hôtel de Langeac. He was in Paris at the storming of the Bastille and consulted with Lafayette as the latter was drafting the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Jefferson frequently had his mail opened by postmasters, so he created his own enciphering mechanism, a full cipher. He penned crucial messages in code for the rest of his career. Jefferson, who was unable to attend the 1787 Constitution Convention, approved the document but wished to see the promised Bill of Rights included. Jefferson departed Paris for America in September 1789. He remained a strong supporter of the French Revolution while condemning its more brutal aspects. Secretary of State. Soon after returning from France, Jefferson accepted President Washington's offer to serve as Secretary of State. At the time, pressing challenges included the national debt and the capital's permanent location. He opposed a national debt, preferring that each state retire its own, as opposed to Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, who advocated for the federal government to consolidate states' debts. Hamilton also had ambitious ambitions to establish a national credit and a national bank, but Jefferson was adamantly opposed and worked to undercut his program, nearly leading Washington to dismiss him from cabinet. He eventually quit the government willingly. The second key problem was the capital's permanent site. Hamilton preferred a capital close to the Northeast's major commercial hubs, whilst Washington, Jefferson, and other agrarians desired one further south. After a lengthy standoff, the Compromise of 1790 was reached, permanently establishing the capital on the Potomac River and assuming the war debts of all 13 founding states. Jefferson's objectives were to reduce American reliance on British commerce and to increase commercial trade with France. He hoped that by weakening Spanish colonialism in the Trans-Appalachian West and British rule in the North, he could help to pacify Native Americans. Jefferson and political protege Congressman James Madison created the National Gazette in 1791. Along with author Philip Freneau, they attempted to undermine Hamilton's Federalist policies, which Hamilton was advocating through the influential Federalist publication The Gazette of the United States. The National Gazette was particularly critical of Hamilton's policies, typically through anonymous writings signed by the pen name Brutus at Jefferson's request and actually penned by Madison. Jefferson and Madison went on vacation to Vermont in the spring of 1791. Jefferson had headaches and was tired of bickering with Hamilton. In May 1792, Jefferson became concerned about the emerging political rivalry. He wrote to Washington, begging him to run for re-election that year as a unifying force. He asked the president to organize citizens behind a party that would preserve democracy from the corrupting influence of banking and vested interests, as advocated by the Federalists. Historians regard this letter as the first expression of Democratic-Republican Party ideals. Jefferson, Madison, and other Democratic-Republican activists supported state rights and local authority while opposing federal concentration of power, whereas Hamilton advocated for more federal power. When the two nations fought in 1793, Jefferson preferred France over Britain, but his arguments in the cabinet were undermined by French revolutionary diplomat Edmund Charles Jennet's obvious contempt for Washington. In his conversations with British Minister George Hammond, He unsuccessfully attempted to persuade the British to abandon their positions in the Northwest and to recompense the United States for slaves that the British had freed at the end of the war. Jefferson sought a return to private life and resigned from the government in December 1793. He may also have wished to increase his political influence outside the administration. After the Washington administration concluded the Jay Treaty with Britain in 1794, Jefferson saw a reason to unify his party and led a national opposition from Monticello. The treaty, created by Hamilton, sought to decrease hostilities while increasing trade. Jefferson worried that it would strengthen British influence and destroy republicanism, calling it the boldest act Hamilton and Jay ever ventured on to undermine the government. The treaty approved, but it expired in 1805 during Jefferson's presidency and was not renewed. Jefferson maintained his pro-France stance. Even amid the brutality of the Reign of Terror, he refused to abandon the revolution. To back away from France would be to undermine the cause of republicanism in America. Election of 1796 and Vice Presidency. Jefferson was chosen vice president in 1796 after losing the Electoral College vote to Federalist John Adams 71-68. As presiding officer of the Senate, he was more passive than his predecessor, John Adams. He enabled the Senate to debate freely and limited his participation to procedural concerns, describing it as a honorable and easy job. Jefferson had previously studied parliamentary law and procedure for 40 years, making him well suited to serve as presiding officer. In 1800, he released a manual of parliamentary practice, a collection of his Senate process notes. He had only 3 tie-breaking votes in the Senate. In 4 private conversations with French consul Joseph Latom in the spring of 1797, Jefferson assailed Adams. He anticipated that his opponent will only serve 1 term. He also urged France to invade England and recommended Latom to detain any American envoys sent to Paris. This tightened the French government's attitude against the Adams administration. After Adams' original peace envoys were turned down, Jefferson and his supporters fought for the release of documents linked to the incident, dubbed the XYZ affair after the letters used to conceal the identity of the French officers involved. However, the strategy backfired when it was exposed that French authorities had demanded bribes, galvanizing public opinion against France. The United States launched an undeclared naval war with France known as the Quasi-War. During Adams' presidency, the Federalists rebuilt the military and imposed new taxes and passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. Jefferson argued that these regulations were intended to crush Democratic Republicans rather than pursue enemy foreigners, and he deemed them unlawful. To organize resistance, he and James Madison surreptitiously prepared the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which declared that the federal government had no jurisdiction to wield powers not expressly given to it by states. The resolutions followed Madison's interposition doctrine, which holds that states may protect their citizens against federal laws that they deem unlawful. Jefferson advocated nullification, which allows states to completely invalidate federal legislation. He predicted that, unless arrested at the threshold, the Alien and Sedition Acts would drive these states into revolution and bloodshed. According to historian Ron Chernow, the theoretical damage of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions was profound and lasting, and it was a prescription for disunion, contributing to both the American Civil War and subsequent events. Washington was so horrified by the proposals that he warned Patrick Henry that if systematically and pertinaciously pursued, they would dissolve the Union or produce coercion. Jefferson had long admired Washington's leadership abilities, but he believed that his Federalist Party was taking the country in the wrong path. He declined to attend Washington's burial in 1799 due to sharp disputes with him while serving as Secretary of State. Election of 1800. Jefferson ran for president again against John Adams in 1800. Adams' campaign was hampered by unpopular taxes and bitter Federalist infighting over his role in the Quasi-War. Democratic Republicans cited the Alien and Sedition Acts to accuse the Federalists of being secret pro-British monarchists, while the Federalists accused Jefferson of being a godless libertine loyal to the French. According to historian Joyce Appleby, the election was one of the most acrimonious in the annals of American history. The Democratic Republicans ultimately received more electoral college votes, thanks in part to electors who were added to the population calculation under the 3/5 Compromise, which included 3/5 of the South's slave population. Jefferson and his vice presidential nominee, Aaron Burr, unexpectedly won equal votes. Due to the tie, the election was decided by the Federalist-dominated House of Representatives. Hamilton pushed Federalist representatives on Jefferson's favor, viewing him as a lesser political evil than Burr. On February 17, 1801, the House chose Jefferson as president and Burr as vice president after 36 votes. Democratic-Republican celebrations erupted around the country following the victory. Some President Jefferson's opponents claimed that his win was due to the South's inflated number of electors. Others said that Jefferson obtained James Ashton Bayard's tie-breaking electoral vote by ensuring the continuation of different Federalist positions in government. Jefferson denied the allegations, and the historical evidence is inconclusive. The handover went peacefully and marked a milestone moment in American history. As historian Gordon S. Wood writes, it was one of the first popular elections in modern history that resulted in the peaceful transfer of power from one party to another. Presidency, 1801 to 1809. On March 4, 1801, Jefferson was sworn in as president by Chief Justice John Marshall at the new Capitol in Washington, D.C. The inauguration was not attended by the outgoing President Adams. Unlike his two predecessors, Jefferson disliked formal manners. Instead of using a carriage, he elected to walk to the Capitol with companions from his neighboring boarding house that day. His inaugural address emphasized reconciliation and devotion to democratic ideals, stating, "We have been called by different titles brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans and Federalists." Ideologically, he emphasized equal and exact justice for all men, minority rights, and freedom of speech, religion, and the press. That he claimed that a free and Republican government was the strongest government on earth. He named moderate Republicans to his cabinet, including James Madison as Secretary of State, Henry Dearborn as Secretary of War, Levi Lincoln as Attorney General, and Robert Smith as Secretary of the Navy. Jefferson, who had been widowed since 1782, initially relied on his two daughters as official hostesses. In late May 1801, he requested Dolly Madison, wife of his longtime friend James Madison, to become the permanent White House hostess. She also oversaw the completion of the White House home. Dolly remained as White House hostess for the remainder of Jefferson's 2 terms, followed by 8 years as First Lady while her husband was president. Financial affairs. Jefferson's first priority as president was to reduce the $83 million national debt. He began undermining Hamilton's Federalist fiscal system, assisted by Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin. Gallatin created a plan to reduce the national debt in 16 years with significant annual allocations and tax cuts. The administration abolished the whiskey excise and other taxes after shutting unnecessary offices and reducing useless establishments and expenses. Jefferson viewed the First Bank of the United States as a most deadly hostility to Republican government. Gallatin convinced him not to liquidate the bank before its charter expired in 1811. Gallatin maintained that the National Bank was a beneficial financial organization and sought to expand its operations. Jefferson sought other solutions to the nation's mounting debt. He reduced the Navy, for example, thinking it useless in peacetime, and established a fleet of low-cost gunboats designed solely for domestic defense to avoid provocation by foreign powers. After 2 terms, he reduced the nation's debt from $83 million to $57 million. Domestic affairs. Jefferson pardoned several people imprisoned under the Alien and Sedition Acts. Congressional Republicans revoked the Judiciary Act of 1801, which eliminated nearly all of Adams' midnight judges. A subsequent appointment struggle resulted in the Supreme Court's historic decision, Marbury v. Madison, which established judicial scrutiny of executive branch acts. Jefferson appointed 3 Supreme Court judges, including William Johnson, 1804, Henry Brockholst Livingston, 1807, and Thomas Todd, 1807. Jefferson strongly believed in the need for a national military university to produce an officer engineering corps for a national defense based on scientific advancements, rather than relying on external sources. On March 16, 1802, he signed the Military Peace Establishment Act, which established the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. The act established a new set of laws and limitations for the military. Jefferson also hoped to restructure the executive branch by replacing Federalists and aggressive opponents throughout the officer corps and promoting Republican ideas. Jefferson was very interested in the Library of Congress, which had been created in 1800. He frequently recommended books to purchase. In 1802, Congress authorized Jefferson to nominate the first librarian of Congress and formed a committee to establish library regulations. Congress also granted the President and Vice President the right to use the library. Foreign Affairs, 1801 to 1805. First Barbary War. The Royal Navy safeguarded American trade ships from Barbary Coast pirates while the states were British colonies. Following independence, pirates frequently hijacked U.S. trade ships, pillaged cargoes, and enslaved or kidnapped crew members for ransom. Jefferson had been against paying tribute to the Barbary states since 1785. In 1801, he authorized the United States Navy fleet, led by Commodore Richard Dale, to make a show of force in the Mediterranean, becoming the first American naval squadron to cross the Atlantic. Following the fleet's initial engagement, he successfully petitioned Congress for a declaration of war. The First Barbary War was the United States' first foreign war. Pasha of Tripoli. After Yusuf Karamanli took the USS Philadelphia, Jefferson directed William Eaton, the U.S. consul in Tunis, to lead a force to restore the Pasha's older brother to the throne. The American fleet compelled Tunis and Algiers to dissolve their alliance with Tripoli. Jefferson authorized 5 successive naval bombardments of Tripoli, prompting the Pasha to sign a treaty that restored peace in the Mediterranean. This win was only temporary, but according to Wood, many Americans celebrated it as a vindication of their policy of spreading free trade around the world and a great victory for liberty over tyranny. Louisiana Purchase. In 1800, Spain relinquished possession of the Louisiana Territory to France. Jefferson was afraid that Napoleon's ambitions for huge territories would jeopardize continental stability and Mississippi River navigation. He stated that the cession works most sorely on the U.S. It completely reverses all of the United States political relations. In 1802, he directed James Monroe and Robert R. Livingston to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans and the surrounding coastal areas. In early 1803, Jefferson offered Napoleon about $10 million for 40,000 square miles, 100,000 square kilometers, of tropical land. Napoleon knew that French military control over such vast and remote region was unrealistic, and he was in desperate need of cash for his home front campaigns. In early April, 1803 he made a surprising counteroffer to sell 827,987 square miles, 2,144,480 square kilometers, of French territory for $15 million, $371 million in 2023, tripling the size of the U.S. American negotiators accepted the offer and signed the treaty on April 30, 1803. Jefferson did not learn about the surprise purchase until July 3, 1803. He accidentally bought the most productive strip of land of its size on Earth, allowing the new country to be self-sufficient in food and other resources. The sale also considerably reduced European influence in North America, removing barriers to the United States' westward growth. Most people saw this as an outstanding opportunity, notwithstanding Republican concerns about the federal government's constitutional right to buy land. Jefferson first believed that a constitutional amendment was required to purchase and manage the new region. However, he later changed his mind, thinking that this would offer reason to reject the acquisition, and advocated for a quick discussion and passage. On October 20, 1803, the Senate ratified the purchase pact by a vote of 24-7. Jefferson felt humble about inheriting the Louisiana Territory, but he despised critics who dubbed the huge region a howling wilderness. Following the purchase, Jefferson maintained the region's Spanish legal structure and implemented a slow process of incorporating inhabitants into American democracy. He believed that a time of federal control would be required while Louisianans adapted to their new country. Historians have varied on the constitutional consequences of the sale, but they generally see the Louisiana acquisition as a tremendous accomplishment. Frederick Jackson Turner described the purchase as the most significant event in American history. Expeditions. Jefferson anticipated greater westward colonization as a result of the Louisiana Purchase and planned to explore and document the unexplored terrain. He hoped to stake a U.S. claim ahead of competing European interests and discover the legendary Northwest Passage. 198. Jefferson and others were motivated by LePage Dupratz's exploration stories of Louisiana, 1763, and James Cook's of the Pacific, 1784. And they persuaded Congress in 1804 to support an expedition to explore and chart the newly acquired area to the Pacific Ocean. Jefferson assigned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to lead the Corps of Discovery, 1803 to 1806. In the months preceding the expedition, Jefferson tutored Lewis in the sciences of mapping, botany, natural history, mineralogy, astronomy, and navigation, giving him unrestricted access to his library at Monticello, which housed the world's largest collection of books on the geography and natural history of the North American continent, as well as an impressive collection of maps. The trip lasted from May 1804 to September 1806 and yielded a wealth of scientific and geographic information, as well as knowledge of several Indian tribes. Jefferson organized 3 additional Western expeditions: William Dunbar and George Hunter's expedition on the Washita River, 1804 to 1805, the Thomas Freeman and Peter Custis expedition on the Red River, 1806, and the Zebulon Pike expedition into the Rocky Mountains and Southwest, 1806 to 1807. All 3 provided vital information on the American frontier. Wilkinson's misconduct. Commanding General James Wilkinson was a holdover from the Washington and Adams administrations. In 1804, the Spanish paid Wilkinson 12,000 pesos for information on American boundary intentions. Wilkinson also earned salary advances and payments for claims submitted to Secretary of War Henry Dearborn. Jefferson did not appear to be aware of this detrimental knowledge. Jefferson trusted Wilkinson and named him as governor of Louisiana Territory in 1805, complimenting his work ethic. In January 1806, Kentucky U.S. Attorney Joseph Davies informed Jefferson that Wilkinson was on the Spanish payroll. Jefferson did not take action against Wilkinson because there was insufficient evidence against him at the time. In December 1807, the United States House of Representatives conducted an investigation that cleared Wilkinson. In 1808, a military court investigated the claims against Wilkinson but found insufficient proof. Jefferson kept Wilkinson in the U.S. Army. Evidence discovered in Spanish archives in the 20th century revealed Wilkinson was on the Spanish payroll. Foreign Affairs, 1805 to 1809. Attempted annexation of Florida. Following the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson attempted to conquer West Florida from Spain. On December 3, 1805, in his annual message to Congress, Jefferson railed against Spain for depredating the Florida border. A few days later, Jefferson surreptitiously requested a $2 million investment to buy Florida. Floor leader John Randolph opposed annexation and was dissatisfied with Jefferson's secrecy on the topic, believing the money would end up in Napoleon's hands. The $2 million bill was only passed after Jefferson effectively replaced Randolph with Barnabas Bidwell as floor leader. This sparked distrust of Jefferson and accusations of improper executive influence over Congress. Jefferson signed the bill into law in February 1806. 6 weeks later, the law became public. The $2 million were to be sent to France as payment, putting pressure on Spain to allow the U.S. to annex Florida. France, however, declined the offer, and Florida remained under Spanish sovereignty. The failing attempt harmed Jefferson's reputation with his fans. The Chesapeake Leopard Affair. From 1806 to 1807, the British seized American ships in search of British deserters. As a result, American citizens were recruited into the British Naval Service. In 1806, Jefferson called for a boycott of British goods. On April 18, Congress approved the Non-Importation Acts, which were never enforced. Later that year, Jefferson urged James Monroe and William Pinckney to negotiate an end to the harassment of American shipping, but Britain showed no signs of repairing relations. The Monroe-Pinckney Treaty was finalized, but it contained no provisions to terminate British policy, therefore Jefferson refused to submit it to the Senate for passage. In June 1807, the British cruiser HMS Leopard fired upon the USS Chesapeake off the Virginia coast. Jefferson issued a proclamation prohibiting armed British ships from entering United States seas. He assumed unilateral authority to call on states to prepare 100,000 militia and ordered the acquisition of arms, ammunition, and supplies, stating, "The laws of necessity, of self-preservation, of saving our country when in danger, are of higher obligation. than strict observance of written laws. The USS Revenge was sent to demand an answer from the British government, but it was also fired at. Jefferson called a special session of Congress in October to impose an embargo or discuss war. Embargo, 1807 to 1809. In December 1807, Napoleon announced that he had extended the Berlin Decree, which prohibited British goods worldwide. In Britain, King George III ordered a redoubling of impressment attempts, which included American seamen. But Congress has no desire to prepare the United States for war. Jefferson requested and received the Embargo Act, which gave the United States more time to strengthen its defenses, militias, and naval forces. According to Meacham, the Embargo Act was more powerful than the Alien and Sedition Acts. According to R.B. Bernstein, Jefferson was pursuing policies resembling those he had cited in 1776 as grounds for independence and revolution. In November 1807, Jefferson spent several days meeting with his cabinet to address the deteriorating diplomatic situation. Secretary of State James Madison backed the embargo, but Treasury Secretary Gallatin opposed it because of its unlimited duration and the risk to American neutrality. The U.S. economy suffered, criticism increased, and opponents began to avoid the embargo. Instead of retreating, Jefferson dispatched federal agents to secretly chase down smugglers and violators. Congress passed three measures in 1807 and 1808, the supplementary, additional, and enforcement measures. The government could not stop American vessels from trading with European belligerents once they departed American ports, despite the fact that the embargo caused a severe drop in exports. In December 1807, Jefferson stated that he would not seek a third term. During his final year as president, he focused more on Monticello, allowing Madison and Gallatin nearly complete power. Jefferson signed the Embargo Repeal Act shortly before leaving office in March 1809. In its place, the Non-Intercourse Act was enacted, but it was no more effective. Jefferson stated that he felt like a prisoner, released from his chains, the day before Madison was installed as his successor. Post-presidency, 1809 to 1826. After his administration, Jefferson remained powerful and continued to correspond with many of the country's leaders, including his two protégés who succeeded him as president. The Monroe Doctrine has a striking resemblance to the counsel Jefferson provided Monroe in 1823. University of Virginia. Jefferson envisioned a university devoid of church pressures, where students might concentrate in new fields and not available at other universities. He felt that education created a stable society, hence publicly funded schools should be available based simply on aptitude. He first proposed his university in a letter to Joseph Priestley in 1800, and the University of Virginia was formed in 1819. He coordinated the state legislative campaign for its charter and, with Edmund Bacon's help, purchased the property. He was the primary architect of the buildings, developed the university's curriculum, and served as the first rector when it opened in 1825. Jefferson was a big supporter of Greek and Roman architectural traditions, which he saw as best emblematic of American democracy. Each academic unit, known as a pavilion, was created with a two-story temple facade, while the library rotunda was based after the Roman Pantheon. Jefferson referred to the university grounds as the academical village, and he designed it to reflect his educational beliefs. The 10 pavilions contained classrooms and faculty apartments. They formed a quadrangle and were linked by colonnades that housed the student rooms. Gardens and vegetable fields were located behind the pavilions. They were enclosed by serpentine walls, demonstrating the importance of the agrarian lifestyle. The university's central building was a library rather than a cathedral, highlighting its secular nature, which was contentious at the time. When Jefferson died in 1826, James Madison succeeded him as rector. Jefferson donated the institution the majority of his repaired library, which had about 2,000 books. Only one other former president has launched a university. Millard Fillmore established the University of Buffalo in 1846. Reconciliation with Adams. Jefferson and John Adams became close friends during the early years of their political careers, serving together in the Continental Congress in the 1770s and in Europe in the 1780s. The Federalist-Republican schism of the 1790s estranged them, and Adams felt deceived by Jefferson's support for partisan attacks like James Callender's. Jefferson was enraged by Adams' appointment of midnight judges. Almost a decade after Jefferson succeeded Adams as president, the two men did not interact directly. Following the death of Jefferson's daughter Polly in 1804, Abigail Adams and Jefferson exchanged a brief letter in an attempt at reconciliation that Adams was unaware of. However, an exchange of letters reignited open hostility between Adams and Jefferson. Benjamin Rush began encouraging the two to reconnect through correspondence as early as 1809. Adams sent Jefferson a brief New Year's greeting in 1812, spurred by Rush, to which Jefferson answered enthusiastically. This inaugural correspondence marked the start of what historian David McCullough calls one of the most extraordinary correspondences in American history. Over the next 14 years, Jefferson and Adams wrote 158 letters detailing their political differences, explaining their individual roles in events, and debating the Revolution's global significance. When Adams died on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, his final words were a tribute to his lifelong friend and competitor. Thomas Jefferson survives, Adams said, ignorant that Jefferson had died a few hours before. Autobiography. Jefferson began writing his autobiography of Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1790 in 1821, at the age of 77, and stated that he hoped to state some recollections of dates and facts concerning myself. He focused on his hardships and achievements until July 29, 1790, when the story came to an end. He omitted his youth and emphasized the Revolutionary era. He explained that his family moved from Wales to America in the early 17th century and landed on the Virginia colony's western border, which impacted his support for individual and state rights. Jefferson described his father as ignorant but possessing a strong mind and sound judgment. He also discussed his enrollment at the College of William and Mary and his election to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1775. He opposed the idea of a privileged aristocracy made up of large landowning families partial to the king, instead promoting the aristocracy of virtue and talent, which nature has wisely provided for the direction of societal interests, and distributed with equal hand through all its conditions, was regarded fundamental to a well-ordered republic. The essay focuses on the Declaration of Independence and Virginian political reform. He told many of the stories through notes, letters, and papers. He stated that this history was so rich that his personal troubles might be neglected, but he also included a self-analysis based on the Declaration of Independence and other patriotism. Greek War of Independence. Thomas Jefferson was a Philhellene, or lover of Greek culture, who supported the Greek War of Independence. He has been considered as the most important of the founding fathers who supported the Greek cause, comparing it to the American Revolution. By 1823, Jefferson had exchanged views with Greek scholar Adamantios Korais. Jefferson instructed Korais on developing Greece's political system using classical liberalism and precedents from the American governmental system, eventually prescribing a government similar to that of a U.S. state. He also proposed implementing a classical education system for the newly formed First Hellenic Republic. The Greek people accepted Jefferson's intellectual instructions. Korais became one of the Greek constitution's designers and encouraged his companions to read Jefferson's works as well as other American revolutionary literature. Lafayette's visit. In the summer of 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette accepted President James Monroe's offer to visit the country. Jefferson and Lafayette hadn't seen one another since 1789. After visiting New York, New England, and Washington, Lafayette arrived at Monticello on November 4. Randolph, Jefferson's grandson, was present and documented the reunion. As they approached each other, their uncertain gait quickened itself into a shuffling run, and exclaiming, "Jefferson! Ah, Lafayette!" they burst into tears as they fell into each other's arms. Jefferson and Lafayette then retired to their house to reminisce. The following morning, Jefferson, Lafayette, and James Madison attended a tour and banquet at the University of Virginia. Jefferson had someone else read a speech he had prepared for Lafayette since his voice was weak and unable to carry. This was his final public presentation. After an 11-day visit, Lafayette wished Jefferson farewell and left Monticello. Final days, death, and burial. Jefferson's debt of around $100,000 weighed hard on his mind in his final months, as it became evident that he would leave little to his heirs. In February 1826, he successfully petitioned the General Assembly to establish a public lottery as a fundraiser. In July 1825, his health began to worsen as a result of rheumatism caused by arm and wrist injuries, as well as digestive and urinary diseases. In June 1826, he was confined to bed. Jefferson turned down an offer to attend a Declaration of Independence commemoration celebration in Washington on July 3, citing a fever. During his final hours, he was surrounded by family and friends. Jefferson died at the age of 83 on July 4, 1826, at 12:50 p.m., commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. In the hours before his death, Jefferson told his treating physician, "No, doctor, nothing more," denying laudanum. However, his final major remarks were, "Is it the fourth, or this is the fourth?" When John Adams died later that day, his final words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives," despite the fact that Jefferson had died many hours before. The sitting president was Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, who described their deaths on the nation's anniversary as visible and palpable remarks of divine favor. Shortly after Jefferson died, attendants discovered a gold locket on a chain around his neck, which contained a small faded blue ribbon wrapped around a lock of his wife Martha's hair. Jefferson was buried at Monticello, with an epitaph he wrote. "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." In his later years, Jefferson became increasingly concerned that people would grasp the concepts of the Declaration of Independence and the persons who wrote it, and he frequently defended himself as its author. In addition to establishing the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom and building the University of Virginia, he considered the text to be one of his greatest life achievements. Political roles, including his president, are not mentioned in his tombstone. Jefferson died significantly in debt, unable to leave his estate freely to his heirs. He included instructions in his will for the disposition of his assets, including the release of Sally Hemings' children, but his estate, valuables, and slaves were sold at public auctions beginning in 1827. In 1831, Monticello was sold by Martha Jefferson Randolph and the other heirs. Political, social, and religious views. Jefferson believed in the political ideas of John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton, whom he regarded as three of the finest men of all time. He was also inspired by the works of Gibbon, Hume, Robertson, Bolingbroke, Montesquieu, and Voltaire. Jefferson believed that autonomous yeomanry and rural living were ideal Republican traits. He distrusted cities and financiers, advocated for decentralized government control, and blamed Europe's despotism on corrupt political structures and monarchies. He backed efforts to disestablish the Church of England, drafted the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and advocated for a wall between church and state. The Republicans under Jefferson were heavily influenced by the 18th-century British Whig Party, which believed in a small government. His Democratic-Republican Party dominated early American politics, and his ideas became known as Jeffersonian democracy. Philosophy, society, and government. Jefferson produced a lot of letters and speeches, demonstrating that he was well-versed in both modern and ancient philosophical literature. Nonetheless, some researchers do not see Jefferson as a philosopher, primarily since he did not write a systematic treatise on philosophy. However, he has been described as one of the most outstanding philosophical figures of his time because his work provided both the theoretical background and substance to the social and political events of the Revolutionary years, as well as the development of the American Constitution in the 1770s and 1780s. Jefferson continued to focus on more theoretical concerns of natural philosophy, leaving behind a rich philosophical legacy in the shape of presidential messages, correspondence, and public documents. Jefferson identified as an Epicurean, and while he accepted the Stoic belief in intuition and found consolation in the Stoic focus on patient suffering of misfortune, he rejected the majority of Stoicism, with the significant exception of Epictetus' books. Close paraphrasing, he opposed the Stoics' idea of a separate soul, as well as their fatalism, and was offended by their portrayal of Epicureanism as simply hedonism. Close paraphrasing. Jefferson was familiar with Epicurean philosophy from its ancient sources, but he also cited Pierre Gassendi's Syntagma Philosophicum as an influence on his Epicurean thoughts. Jefferson's theory states that citizens have certain inalienable rights, and that rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will, within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. A strong supporter of the jury system, he declared in 1801, "I consider trial by jury as the only anchor yet imagined by man, by which a government can be held to the principles of its constitution." The Jeffersonian government not only banned individuals and society from intruding on the liberty of others, but it also refrained from undermining individual liberty as a safeguard against tyranny by the majority. Initially, Jefferson advocated for limiting voting to individuals who could freely express their reason while avoiding corrupting dependence on others. He pushed for the enfranchisement of the vast majority of Virginians, aiming to broaden suffrage to include yeoman farmers, who held their own property but excluding tenant farmers, city day laborers, vagrants, most American Indians, and women. He believed that individual liberty were the result of political equality, which was threatened by arbitrary authority. He believed that institutional corruption, not human nature, was to blame for democratic excesses. He was less skeptical of a functioning democracy than his contemporaries. As president, Jefferson was concerned that the federal system established by Washington and Adams had encouraged corrupt favoritism and reliance. He strove to restore a balance between state and federal administrations that more closely resembled the Articles of Confederation, trying to bolster state prerogatives when his party was in power. Jefferson was schooled in the British Whig tradition of the downtrodden majority up against a consistently unresponsive court party in Parliament. He supported minor rebellions as necessary to persuade monarchical regimes to change oppressive policies that jeopardize popular liberty. He agreed that it will often be exercised when wrong, in a republican society ruled by the majority. Furthermore, the remedy is to set them right as to facts, pardon and pacify them. As Jefferson seen his party succeed in 2 presidential terms and launch into a third under James Madison, his idea of the United States as a continental republic and an empire of liberty became more optimistic. On leaving the presidency, he referred to the United States as trusted with the destinies of this solitary republic of the world, the only monument of human rights, and the sole depository of the sacred fire of freedom and self-government. Jefferson advocated for American expansionism, stating in 1801 that it is impossible not to look forward to distant times when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits, and cover the whole northern, if not the southern continent. Democracy. Jefferson saw democracy as the manifestation of society and advocated for national self-determination, cultural conformity, and education for all male citizens of the Commonwealth. He viewed public education and a free press as critical components of a democratic society. After retiring as Secretary of State in 1795, Jefferson focused on the Republican and Federalist electoral basis. He pushed for the Republican classification, which encompassed the entire body of landholders everywhere and the body of laborers who did not own land. With the election of 1796, Republicans rallied around Jefferson as vice president, expanding democracy at the grassroots level across the country. Jefferson endorsed Republican candidates for local positions. Jefferson's political endeavors were founded on egalitarian appeals, beginning with his electioneering for the Revolution of 1800. In his later years, he described the 1800 election as real a revolution in the principles of our government as that of 76 was in its form, one not effected indeed by the sword, but by the suffrage of the people. During Jefferson's administration, voter turnout increased to unimaginable levels, as compared to the Federalist era, from over 67,000 in 1800 to roughly 143,000 in 1804. At the start of the American Revolution, Jefferson agreed William Blackstone's thesis that property ownership would properly empower voters' independent judgment, but he wanted to broaden suffrage by distributing land to the poor. During and after the Revolutionary War, numerous states increased voting eligibility from landed gentry to all propertied male, tax-paying citizens, with Jefferson's approval. In retirement, he became increasingly critical of his native state for breaking the principle of equal political rights, the social right to universal male suffrage. To address the unequal treatment of slaveholding districts, he advocated for general suffrage for all taxpayers and militiamen, as well as equal population representation in the Universal Assembly. Religion. Jefferson was baptized as a child and eventually became a governing member of his local Episcopal church in Charlottesville, which he also attended with his daughters. However, Jefferson rejected biblical conceptions of Christianity. Jefferson was influenced by deist writings during his college years and abandoned traditional Christianity after reviewing New Testament teachings. Jefferson has been regarded as a supporter of the liberal religious strand of deism, which emphasizes reason over revelation. Nonetheless, Jefferson declared in 1803, "I am Christian," in the only sense in which Jesus wished anyone to be. Jefferson later characterized Christianity as following Jesus' plain teachings. Jefferson, influenced by Joseph Priestley, compiled New Testament portions from Jesus' teachings into a private book called The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, sometimes known as the Jefferson Bible, which was never published during his lifetime. Jefferson believed that Paul the Apostle, the Gospel writers, and Protestant reformers had clouded and corrupted Jesus' teachings. According to Peterson, Jefferson was a theist whose God was the creator of the universe, all the evidences of nature testified to his perfection, and man could rely on the harmony and beneficence of his work. In a letter to John Adams, Jefferson stated that what he believed was truly Christ's, as described in the Gospels, was as easily distinguishable as diamonds in a dunghill. By removing miracles and the resurrection, Jefferson made Jesus more compatible with a rational worldview. Jefferson was strongly anti-clerical, arguing that every age, the priest has been hostile to liberty, they have perverted the purest religion ever preached to man into mystery and jargon. The whole letter to Horatio Spafford can be seen at the National Archives. Jefferson was previously in favor of excluding clerics from holding public office, but later changed his mind. In 1777, he created the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom. Ratified in 1786, it made mandatory attendance or donations to any state-sanctioned religious establishment unlawful and declared that men shall be free to profess their opinions in matters of religion. The statute is one of only 3 accomplishments he picked as his epitaph. Early in 1802, Jefferson wrote to the Danbury, Connecticut Baptist Association that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God. He saw the First Amendment as creating a wall of separation between church and state. The phrase separation of church and state has been used multiple times by the Supreme Court in its interpretation of the Establishment Clause. Jefferson gave to the American Bible Society, claiming that the 4 evangelists provided humanity with a pure and sublime system of morality. He believed that Americans will rationally establish a apiarian religion by combining the best traditions of each faith. He financially supported various local denominations near Monticello. Recognizing that organized religion would always play a role in politics, he pushed people to investigate religion using reason rather than supernatural revelation. He believed in a creator God, an afterlife, and the essence of religion as loving God and neighbor. However, he controversially rejected core Christian beliefs, including the conventional Christian Trinity, Jesus' divinity as the Son of God, miracles, the resurrection of Christ, atonement for sin, and original sin. Jefferson thought that original sin was a terrible injustice. Jefferson's unconventional religious beliefs were a major issue in the 1800 presidential election. Federalists denounced him as an atheist. As president, Jefferson responded to the accusations by praising religion in his inauguration address and attending Capitol services. Banks. Jefferson distrusted government banks and opposed public borrowing, which he believed caused long-term debt, bred monopolies, and encouraged risky speculation over productive labor. In one letter to Madison, he urged that each generation should pay off all debts within 19 years rather than imposing long-term debts on future generations. In 1791, President Washington asked Jefferson, then Secretary of State, and Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, if Congress had the right to establish a national bank. While Hamilton believed this, Jefferson and Madison argued that a national bank would overlook the interests of individuals and farms while also violating the 10th Amendment by assuming powers not granted to the federal government by the states. Hamilton successfully contended that the implicit powers granted to the federal government by the Constitution justified the establishment of a national bank, among other governmental activities. Jefferson made agricultural resistance to banks and speculators the first distinguishing feature of his opposition party, recruiting candidates for Congress on the issue as early as 1792. As president, Jefferson was persuaded by Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin to keep the bank intact but to limit its role. Slavery. Jefferson lived in a planter economy based mostly on slavery, and as a wealthy landowner, he employed slave labor for his family, plantation, and workshops. He began recording his slaveholding in 1774, when he numbered 41 enslaved persons. Over his lifetime, he held over 600 slaves. He inherited approximately 175 persons, and the majority of the remaining were born on his plantations. Jefferson bought some slaves to reconcile their families. He sold about 110 persons for economic reasons, mostly slaves from his outlying holdings. In 1784, when he most likely possessed over 200 slaves, he began to sell many of them, and by 1794, he had sold 161 of them. Monticello housed approximately 100 slaves at any given time. In 1817, the farm had its maximum slave population of 140 people. Jefferson once observed, "My first wish is that the laborers be well treated." Jefferson would not work his slaves on Sundays or Christmas, and he gave them extra personal time in the winter months. Some researchers question Jefferson's generosity, citing instances of severe slave whippings during his absence. His nail factory was manned entirely by enslaved children. Many enslaved boys became traders. Jefferson believed that slavery was bad for both slaves and masters, but he was hesitant to free slaves and argued for gradual emancipation. In 1779, he recommended gradual voluntary training and resettlement to the Virginia Assembly, and 3 years later, he wrote laws allowing slaveholders to free their own slaves. In his draft of the Declaration of Independence, he included a sentence that was removed by other Southern delegates, denouncing King George III for allegedly imposing slavery on the colonies. In 1784, Jefferson suggested abolishing slavery in all western U.S. territory and limiting slave imports to 15 years. Congress, however, failed to pass his idea by a single vote. In 1787, Congress established the Northwest Ordinance, granting Jefferson a partial success by abolishing slavery in the Northwest Territory. Jefferson emancipated his slave, Robert Hemings, in 1794, and his cook slave, James Hemings, in 1796. In 1822, Jefferson released his runaway slave Harriet Hemings. When Jefferson died in 1826, he emancipated 5 male Hemings slaves in his bequest. During his presidency, Jefferson allowed slavery to spread into the Louisiana Territory in the hopes of preventing slave uprisings in Virginia and South Carolina's secession. In 1804, Jefferson and Congress agreed to a 1-year moratorium on domestic slave trafficking into the Louisiana Territory. In 1806, he publicly sought for anti-slavery legislation to prohibit the import or export of slaves. Congress enacted the statute in 1807. In 1819, Jefferson fiercely opposed a Missouri statehood application amendment that prohibited domestic slave importation and liberated slaves at the age of 25, claiming it would ruin the Union. In Notes on the State of Virginia, he sparked controversy by describing slavery as a moral sin for which the nation will eventually have to account to God. Jefferson expressed his suspicion that black people were mentally and physically inferior to whites, but contended that they nevertheless have inherent human rights. He therefore supported colonization plans that would convey liberated slaves to another country, such as Liberia or Sierra Leone, notwithstanding their impracticality. During his administration, Jefferson remained largely silent on the question of slavery and emancipation, as the congressional dispute over slavery and its extension created a perilous North-South schism among the states, with rumors of a Northern Confederacy in New England. The violent attacks on white slave owners during the Haitian Revolution in response to slavery's injustices fueled Jefferson's fears of a race war, causing him to reconsider pursuing emancipation. After several tries and failures to achieve emancipation, Jefferson privately stated in an 1805 letter to William H. Burwell, "I have long since given up the expectation of any early provision for the extinguishment of slavery among us." That same year, he also tied this thought to George Logan by writing, "I have most carefully avoided every public act or manifestation on that subject." Jefferson-Hemings controversy. Since 1802, there has been discussion over claims that Jefferson fathered children with Sally Hemings, his slave, following the death of his wife. In that year, James T. Callender claimed Jefferson had taken Hemings as a concubine and fathered multiple children with her after Callender was turned down for a postmaster's position. A group of researchers studied the Y-DNA of two living descendants, Field, Jefferson's uncle, and Eston Hemings, Hemings's son. The investigation was done in 1998. The male Jefferson line was matched, according to the results. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, TJF, then assembled a 9-historian research team to examine the situation. The DNA study indicates a high probability that Thomas Jefferson fathered Eston Hemings. The TJF report found. The TJF also established that Jefferson was most likely the father of every kid Hemings had registered at Monticello. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, TJF, declared in July 2017 that they had discovered what they believed to be Sally Hemings's quarters next to Jefferson's bedroom during archaeological investigations at Monticello. The majority of historians have agreed that Jefferson had a sexual relationship with Sally Hemings and was the father of her son Eston Hemings ever since the findings of the DNA tests were made public. However, other academics argue that the evidence is insufficient to establish Jefferson's fatherhood beyond a reasonable doubt. They underline the possibility that additional Jefferson males, such as his brother Randolph Jefferson and any one of Randolph's 4 kids, or his cousin, could have been identified based on DNA and other data. Possibly the father of Sally Hemings's offspring. Merrill Peterson, a historian, stated in 2002 that, in the absence of direct documentary evidence either proving or refuting the allegation, nothing conclusive can be said about Jefferson's relations with Sally Hemings. Peterson stated that the results of the DNA testing of Jefferson and Hemings' descendants provided support for the idea that Jefferson was the father of at least one of Sally Hemings's children, in reference to the 1998 DNA study. Sally Hemings was permitted by Martha, the daughter of Thomas Jefferson, to reside in Charlottesville as a free woman with her 2 sons following Jefferson's death in 1826, even though she was never formally manumitted. She lived there until her death in 1835. The descendants of Sally Hemings were denied the opportunity to be buried at Monticello by the Monticello Association. Activities and interests. Jefferson was a farmer who was preoccupied with novel crops, soil conditions, garden designs, and scientific agricultural methods. Tobacco was his main cash crop, but it was rarely lucrative due to poor prices. He attempted to achieve self-sufficiency by raising wheat, vegetables, flax, corn, hogs, sheep, poultry, and cattle to feed his family, slaves, and employees, but he always lived over his means and was in debt. Jefferson learned architecture by self-study. His primary source was Andrea Palladio's 1570 work The 4 Books of Architecture, which defines the principles of classical design. Jefferson popularized the Neo-Palladian style in the United States, with designs for the Virginia State Capitol, the University of Virginia, Monticello, and other structures. It has been suggested that he was inspired by the Château de Rastignac in southwest France, whose plans he saw during his ambassadorship, to persuade the White House architect to change the south portico to mimic the chateau. In archaeology, in 1784, Jefferson began digging 7 Native American burial mounds in Virginia using the trench method. His explorations were spurred by the mound builders question, and his methodical approach allowed him to observe the stratigraphic layout, diverse human remains, and other artifacts within the mound. The evidence found at the site gave him enough understanding to concede that he saw no reason why the ancestors of modern Native Americans couldn't have built those mounds. He enjoyed birds and wine and was a well-known gourmet. As a naturalist, he was captivated by the Natural Bridge geological structure, which he successfully obtained in 1774 through a grant from George III. American Philosophical Society. Jefferson was a member of the American Philosophical Society for 35 years, starting in 1780. He propagated science and Enlightenment ideas through society, emphasizing the importance of scientific knowledge in reinforcing and expanding freedom. His notes on the state of Virginia were written in part as a societal contribution. He became the Society's third president on March 3, 1797, just months after being elected Vice President of the United States. When he accepted the position, Jefferson said, "I feel no qualification for this distinguished post but a sincere zeal for all the objects of our institution and an ardent desire to see knowledge so disseminated through the mass of mankind that it may at length reach even the extremes of society, beggars and kings." On March 10, 1797, Thomas Jefferson delivered a speech, which was eventually published as a paper in 1799, about the skeletal remains of an extinct gigantic sloth named Megalonyx that saltpeter workers discovered in a cave in what is now Monroe County, West Virginia. Jefferson is regarded as a pioneer of scientific paleontology study in North America. Jefferson presided over the American Philosophical Society for the following 18 years, spanning both terms. He invited Meriwether Lewis to the club, and many scientists tutored him in preparation for the Lewis and Clark expedition. He resigned on January 20, 1815, but remained involved via correspondence. Linguistics. Jefferson was fluent in several languages, including French, Greek, Italian, and German, and was passionate in linguistics. In his early years, he excelled at classical languages. Jefferson later saw Greek as the perfect language based on its rules and philosophy. He taught himself Italian while attending the College of William and Mary. Jefferson initially became acquainted with the Anglo-Saxon language, particularly as it related to English common law and administration, and studied it linguistically and philosophically. He had 17 volumes of Anglo-Saxon literature and grammar and later published an essay about the Anglo-Saxon language. Jefferson claimed to have taught himself Spanish on his 19-day trip to France, using just a grammar book and a copy of Don Quixote. Linguistics had a tremendous impact on how Jefferson conceptualized and communicated political and philosophical views. He believed that studying old languages was crucial for understanding the origins of current language. He collected and understood a variety of American Indian vocabularies, and he directed Lewis and Clark to record and collect several Indian languages during their expedition. When Jefferson left Washington after his presidency, he put 50 Native American vocabulary lists in a chest and brought them back to Monticello via riverboat with the rest of his belongings. A robber took the hefty chest somewhere along the way, believing it was full of valuables, but when he saw it was merely full of papers, he threw its contents into the James River. Subsequently, 30 years of collection were lost, with only a few shards recovered from the river's muddy banks. Jefferson was not a great orator and preferred to speak in writing or be silent if feasible. Rather than delivering his State of the Union addresses himself, Jefferson drafted the annual remarks and had a representative read them to Congress. This began a tradition that lasted until 1913, when President Woodrow Wilson decided to deliver his own State of the Union address. Inventions. Jefferson's inventions include a revolving bookstand and a great clock, driven by Cannonball's gravitational pull. He improved the pedometer, the polygraph, a device for reproducing writing, and the moldboard plow, which he never patented and left to posterity. Jefferson is also credited with inventing the swivel chair, which he first designed and used to write much of the Declaration of Independence. He first opposed patents but ultimately backed them. As Secretary of State from 1790 to 1793, he served as the ex officio head of the three-member Patent Evaluation Board. He drafted amendments to U.S. patent law that resulted in his release from this responsibility in 1793, as well as a significant shift to the patent system. As minister to France, Jefferson was inspired by the military standardization effort known as the Système Gribouille, and as president, he launched a program to develop interchangeable rifle parts. He obtained multiple honorary Doctor of Law degrees in recognition of his originality and brilliance. Legacy. Jefferson is a symbol of individual liberty, democracy, and republicanism, known as the author of the Declaration of Independence, the architect of the American Revolution, and a Renaissance man who encouraged science and research. He championed participatory democracy and expanded suffrage, which defined his era and set the standard for subsequent generations. Meacham believed that Jefferson was the most influential figure in the Democratic Republic's first half-century, followed by presidential supporters James Madison, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, and Martin Van Buren. The Siena Research Institute poll of presidential academics, which began in 1982, has continuously named Jefferson as one of the 5 best U.S. presidents, while a 2015 Brookings Institution poll of American Political Science Association members selected him as the 5th greatest president. Memorials and honors. Jefferson has been honored with monuments, statues, postage, and coinage. In the 1920s, artist Gutzon Borglum picked Jefferson, George Washington, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln to be represented in a stone national memorial at Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills of South Dakota, which was approved by President Calvin Coolidge. The Jefferson Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. in 1943, on the 200th anniversary of Jefferson's birth. The interior of the memorial features a 19-foot, 6 statue of Jefferson by Rudolph Evans, as well as reproductions of quotations from Jefferson's writings. The words etched surrounding the Jefferson Memorial are the most conspicuous of these texts. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man, Jefferson wrote in a letter to Benjamin Rush on September 23, 1800. In October 2021, in response to lobbying, the New York City Public Design Commission voted unanimously to remove the plaster model of the Jefferson statue that currently stands in the United States Capitol Rotunda from the New York City Council chamber, where it had been for over a century. The statue was torn down the next month. I want you to express your personal thoughts and reactions to the documentary in the comments area. Use this chance to express your respect for Kuroda's unrelenting tenacity and resilience, as well as your thanks for the sacrifices made by him and his friends. Encourage viewers to subscribe to your YouTube channel in order to join our ever-growing community, and ask them to help spread the word by sharing the video with their friends and family. By raising awareness about this important piece of history, we can ensure that Sergeant Robert Kuroda's and his fellow veterans' legacy lives on and inspires future generations. Through the creation and distribution of this documentary, you have the ability to honor Sergeant Robert Kuroda's legacy in a profound and enduring way, ensuring that his narrative resonates with audiences for years to come.